Okay, hey, today we're going to talk about diagnosing adult autism, which I think is something that's really important because a lot of people have gone through life and maybe they've known something was off, or other people maybe wondered if something was going on, but they've never been formally diagnosed as children for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's economic, or the school just didn't quite know how to go about doing that. So you meet people that are coming into counseling later in life that have no idea what's going on, and you kind of get a sense that autism might be one of the possibilities. So today I want to talk about how we might be able to help these people. And the first thing is just getting a diagnosis. And to do that, you have to do an assessment. So the dilemma is that, some of these people are really struggling socially. They're really struggling financially. They're really struggling to get a job. And they might be in some real trouble. So one of the things that you really have to realize here is that counseling in that sort of Maslow hierarchy of needs kind of sense may not be the best thing you can do for this person at this point. And maybe there are other resources or other people that can help. So one of the first ideas here is, if we can actually go through the process of getting them formally diagnosed, we might be able to actually start solving some of those Maslow sort of problems, helping people with those things like finances and housing and that sort of thing. Now, the one thing about this is supplemental information is extremely important. When you're testing a kid, there's a process. You're talking to teachers, you're observing their behavior, maybe in a classroom or in another setting. You're talking to a pediatrician, but that's not the same process that you would follow with an adult, because it's just simply not going to be available. So you need supplemental information. Not an unreliable narrator is sometimes people just actually don't have a great ability to observe their own lives, and they may not understand what's going on. And so one of the ideas about supplemental information is, we're certainly not accusing people of being dishonest. On the other hand, we're not taking everything on faith either. We want other people that have known this person to speak up here. So whether it be a parent or a teacher or a friend or someone that might have known this person, school reports, doctor's reports, reports from an OT, that sort of thing. So we want to get our hands on as much information as we can, because that can be so important in this process. And we want to verify that. So especially with an adult, one of the things here is, yes, there are test results, and yes, there are things that we can do here. But on the other hand, this is going to be a huge part of putting together the background story as well. So we got to use the available tools. So some of the hallmarks, and we're going to get into the DSM a bit later, but NovoPsych is a great resource in the sense that you can start with some stuff like the AQ and the RADS-R. We'll talk about those a little more. There's a number of tests regarding social masking, empathy, but these two at least give us a starting point. Now, they both come with the qualification that you're not going to make a full autism diagnosis just on the results of one or two tests. You really need to supplement all of that with this really thorough background information, and then we're going to talk about the DSM a bit later. But it is a good place to start. So the AQ, as it's called, Autism Spectrum Quotient, 50-item self-report measure, and this, is asking these questions that match up with some of what is on the DSM in the sense of social functioning. People have the option of answering questions like, is this true in childhood? Is this true now? Or is it true both in childhood and now? Or is it not true at all in childhood or adulthood? So, they have a number, and not, you need people that have a basic reading level and normal intellectual functioning. Some of the questions can be really confusing for people that weren't up to that baseline reading level. So one of the things when you're diagnosing autism, sometimes it goes hand in hand with intellectual disability. It's certainly not every time, and maybe not even in the majority of cases, but you would run across cases where that would also be an issue. So before you engage in these kinds of tests, you need to make sure the comprehension is there. And comprehension is not just being able to read the question. Comprehension is being able to understand the question. So you have to actually do it with them in many cases. And this one called the RADS-R, psychologists always have these clever little abbreviations for every test, but the rads are. It's called the Ritval Autism Asperger. Now, a word about this: Asperger's used to be a very common part of the nomenclature of autism. It's not anymore. We'll talk a little bit about how they classify things now, but many people that have been diagnosed previously would have had a diagnosis of Asperger's, which is very confusing, and I won't go down the rabbit hole of the DSM and why that changed, but suffice to say that would probably be something closer to what we would call level one autism right now. But 80 items, and very similar to the autism quotient, but slightly different. More questions, and again, you need to have the basic reading level there, 18 plus. So once in a while, you'll get somebody that's 17, and you'll find yourself in a bit of a quandary because the childhood questionnaires seem a little too basic, and and like at least in theory you're not able to score the adult test because they're not 18 yet. So you think, okay, geez, what am I going to do with a 17-year-old? But it's not a problem that comes up all the time, but it is something to be aware of. So when you're talking about an IQ of 80, that's one standard deviation of an IQ is 15 points. So that means average would go all the way from 85 to 115. So that's a fairly big spread. Now, someone that would be slightly below average would be more in that 80 range. So again, you want to make sure that they understand the questions. Again, we're talking about comprehension, not just reading. If someone says something like, "I struggle with social functioning as a child," and they say, "Oh, well, what does that mean?" And you explained it, and they said, "Oh, I'm not sure." You might begin to detect that they're not fully comprehending the question. So again, you want to be very aware of that because getting valid test results are important. Social responsiveness scale. So this one really, I think and we'll get into this a bit more, but one of the things that is probably why they're coming to see you if you are having an adult with autism in your office is probably at least some social impairment, trouble making friends, loneliness, struggling to fit in at work, all these things. Sometimes they would be there under the direction of another person. A parent brings them in, or a court has ordered them to be there, or something like that. But in any case, this test really focuses more on the social responsiveness scale because the problem is we have something called chaining, and this happens with other disorders like schizophrenia as well, where we have somebody that has tried to put themselves out into the world, and when they have done that, it hasn't gone well. So the feedback loop is, I've tried to work before and everybody was mean to me, or I went to school and I was bullied. I've tried to join groups, gaming groups, sports groups, and people treated me very oddly. And so now I just keep to myself a little bit. So the chaining can occur when someone withdraws further into themselves because they put themselves into the world and it hasn't gone well. So this is actually quite a common thing. So this test kind of measures some of those sorts of things. So when you don't have, again, when you're testing a kid, the process is quite different because you're really more like observing them kind of as their behavior is happening. Whereas with this, yes, you're doing some of that, and you're doing some of that with any diagnosis you would make in psychology, but it's not the same process as you would use with the child because um, you are not catching them in those developmental years. So when you're looking at this, you're really trying to measure, okay, this is a person has to meet all of these criteria. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts as manifested by the following. Deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotions, or affect to failure to initiate or respond to social interaction. So, what does that mean? It means a lot of what I just said on the last test, which is they're not particularly good at the back and forth of small talk and making friends. And there have been times in their lives where they have really struggled connecting with other people. And so this time you'd really want examples. So if someone came in and I was asking them for examples, maybe they were there with a parent. And and the feedback you got was, oh yeah, they always struggled in groups, or this person used to hide under the table during group activities because they couldn't stand feeling like they were on the spot, or when it came to their time to speak, they would just run and hide because they just didn't know what to say. So again, this person has probably tried to put themselves out there in some way in their lives, and it hasn't gone well. So this is exactly what I was referring to in the last test. All right, so the second criteria that needs to be met is deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures to a total lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communications. Okay, now, so this is a really interesting thing, because the first one tends to be a little more, most people can come up with examples of that first criteria pretty easily. Now this one would be something like eye contact, and this would be a chance for you to observe a person directly. So you're looking at them and they're not making eye contact, and you can just kind of see when they're talking to the receptionist that they've been looking at at the ground or at their shoes, or their eyes drift off as they're speaking to you, or maybe in some cases there could be something like flapping. It doesn't have to be that severe, however, and I guess I want to make that point clear. It certainly could be that, but it could be a lot more subtle than that. A lot of people with autism, the facial expressions don't match the emotions. So I've sat with people with autism, so like, yes, I'm feeling devastated, and they said it in a really flat way that didn't convey any emotions. Most people that use that phrase would say, "Oh my God, I'm feeling devastated," and their body language would support exactly what devastated means to most of us. Whereas the person with autism would say that in a way that would be much flatter, and in a much more kind of subdued kind of way. So when you're looking for examples of this, this one probably could take a little more investigative work than the first one, but most of the time people would be able to come up with examples of this. All right, deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging from example, difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts, to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, to absence of interest in peers. Okay, so this one is really interesting because one of the differential diagnoses with autism is social anxiety. Okay, so you might have some people that really want friends and they want to hang out with people, but they just are too crippled by their anxiety to know how to go about that, or they just avoid those situations because it's just too nerve wracking for them. Okay. Now, people with autism can absolutely have social anxiety, but in some cases, they may not have an interest in hanging out with other people. Most of us have an inherent need to belong to something. We want to be part of the gang. We want to be part of a sports team. We want to be part of classroom activities, but this may not be true for people with autism. So when you're taking a history, you're really looking to see if that matches up. Now, there's a little more to this one, so it says sharing in imaginative play. Okay, so like let's say the teacher says, okay, I've got a creative writing assignment today, and I want you to picture what life was like 100 years ago, and I want you to write a story about life before technology, and what your everyday life might look like, and the person really struggles to imagine something that isn't grounded in reality, and and so you kind of think about this. This is actually quite closely related to the first symptom in terms of the social functioning. So a lot of times you'll find a little overlap between some of these criteria. So maybe you've written this long bit about how their social functioning isn't very good, and then you get to this question, you're like, well, geez, didn't I already answer that question? But in this case, it's asking a little more about these things like adaptation. So in this case, it might be like, let's say a teacher um, makes everybody get into groups during a science class and do something. Now, that person may have been perfectly willing to sit there in that science class and take in the information and listen to what the teacher was saying, but when they have to contribute something to a group, all of a sudden their emotional state changes. You're like, oh, I don't really know what to say here, and I'm kind of on the spot here, and I wasn't really prepared for this, and that kind of thing. So again, you want to really find examples throughout people's school years about how this might look. Now, let's say somebody is 35 and they've worked in IT, and you say, well, do you go out with people after work? And they say, no, never. And you would ask, well, do people in your workplace, do they sometimes go out or, have a Christmas party or celebrate birthday parties in the lunchroom or something? Yeah, they do, but I don't participate in any of that. I don't know what to, I don't know what to say. So again, you would find examples, or at least do an interview with the idea of finding examples about how this might look in someone's life. So again, so we talked about this Asperger's thing earlier, and very interesting, very controversial, quite honestly. They put out a new DSM, give or take, every 10 years, and sometimes there's a versions within versions. And again, I won't take you down that rabbit hole. I think it's more for us psychology nerds. But the newest one is called DSM-5. Okay, so now it's classified as level 1, level 2, and level 3. Now this is actually quite important because at level 1, it's not something where it's very easy to get support. Now there are groups, there are all kinds of groups on Facebook. There are lots of groups that encourage social activities, that kind of thing. But with level 1, the person very well could be working, they very well could be supporting themselves financially, but requires support, may have a hard time communicating with neurotypical peers. Okay, so this person might exist in the world in some way that, but still be struggling. So this would probably be the more common type of person you might see come in for counseling. They have just kind of said, like I just can't seem to. When I start a new job, I just can't seem to blend in with the group, or my whole life I've always felt like an outsider, or even in my school years I tended to keep to myself. So that might be what level 1 would look like. So at level 2, there is a whole lot more of support available in terms of finances, things like transportation, a lot of those more Maslow type of things that we were talking about. So it requires substantial support. So in this case, let's say someone is right on the fringes of being able to work, and by that I mean the environment would really have to be suited and tailored to them, for them to succeed. Otherwise, they could easily become very stressed out and just decide to leave that job. So, in this case, you might have some contact with an employer. You certainly would have contact with something like a social worker or support worker that would be assigned to this person, to help them bridge those gaps. Like for some people, it is something like transportation. They get very nervous on the bus, or they get really nervous trying to navigate public transportation, something like that. So these kinds of people can drive them to job interviews, or perhaps the doctor's appointments, or even to their therapy sessions. So people at level 2 are oftentimes, who you're targeting in terms of who you might help with an autism assessment. So now that may sound funny to say because I previously just said we might be seeing more people at level 1. So but at level 1 there just frankly isn't that much help available. And but at level 2 there is. So again, and you want the results to match up with what the test results and your observations in the background and supplemental information has said. Now, at level 3, we're talking about requiring very substantial support. So I've seen a number of people with level 3. Their language, in some cases, has been very limited. Um, Maybe they just want to talk about like one specific TV show, or one very, very narrow topic like trains or something like that, or in some cases may not be able to speak at all. And again, that may not be everybody with level 3. In some cases, it may be, they just are not even at the point where they would attempt something like getting on a bus to go to a job interview. That's not even a consideration. So for these people, they would probably have a support worker that would be doing substantially more, and maybe with the assistance of a parent, or in some cases maybe even something like live-in help. The idea of group homes encompasses part of level 2 and level 3. There are a lot of ways that potentially could look. All right, so now we get to category B. And the reason I did that leveling, because you have to do the level thing twice. Okay, so we finished with category A. Now we move on to category A. Now we only need to be meeting two of these instead of all of these. So there is quite a difference here, because in some cases, uh, someone might not meet all of these categories, and that's okay. It's not okay in category A. They have to meet all three. But in this one, they only have to meet two of the four. So restricted, repetitive patterns, behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by at least two of the following currently or by history. So, one, stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, lining up toys or flipping objects. And so what you might have here is, and what I hear a lot is, oh, I used to collect model cars when I was a kid, and I'd line them all up by the year and the color, and I'd have a classification system, and no one was allowed to touch my toys. And I used to collect baseball cards and or whatever it is, but they had some way of organizing them that would meet this particular criteria. Um, it certainly could be. Now, this one covers a lot here. In some ways, it could be something like a repetitive motor movement, like, I've had people that just continue to scratch their legs when they get nervous, or some people that pull their hair out, or this could look like a lot of things. So that's why you want to take a really, really careful background sort of interview, because you really want to see what fits here and what doesn't. So this actually could be just certain speech patterns, or certain phrases, or just certain kind of like default ways they have of speaking that might be a little different than what we would consider to be with neurotypical people. All right, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, ritualized patterns, or nonverbal behavior, distress at small changes, difficulty with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals, need to take the same route or eat the same food every day. Now, this one is one of the ones that seems to stand out, at least by my experience, and I've done a number of autism assessments for adults. This one is usually pretty easy to find. Um, oh, yes, as a kid, he would only eat a very, very select group of meals. He could only wear a certain texture, and if I tried to get him to wear something else, he would just he wasn't having it. And this could be the texture of somebody's sheets. It could be the route they actually take to school. So this one actually is really important, because you would find in this case that the stress comes from sudden change to the routine. So again, if you were an employer and you suspected one of your employees had autism, and all of a sudden the company was just going through a major overhaul and everybody's role was changing, and maybe that person used to work privately and now you're asking them to work in an open plan. Now that potentially could be really stressful for that person, because um, they don't do well with change. So again, this one could cover quite a lot of stuff. So again, you're trying to listen really, really carefully. And so maybe at this point in the interview with somebody, we've met criteria 2, but not met criteria 1. That's okay. We just need to meet one more criteria here. Highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Okay, so sometimes people say, "Oh my God, I love Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid. It was the only thing I ever asked for Christmas. I didn't care about anything else. Every single time I got home, I played that." It could be a certain video game. It could be a particular TV show. That's quite a common one. But it's kind of like the person has picked something and made that their world. And sometimes it could be more than one something. Maybe it was Dungeons and Dragons for 5 years, then it became My Little Pony for a couple years or something like that. But what you would find there is, a lot of kids get into stuff for a while, and then they um, move on to something else. But like this kid might, like an example, I'm thinking of, somebody watched Jurassic World and became extremely fixated on dinosaurs, and dinosaurs became everything. Collecting dinosaurs, learning about dinosaurs, classifying dinosaurs. So in that case, you would have met this criteria. So now we would have met the two out of our four. But the fourth criteria, hyper or reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment, apparent indifference to pain, temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures. So this, again, is kind of related to one that we've already done, but it could be just like loud noises. If you took the kid to the mall or a shopping center, it was too overwhelming. It was too much sensory information. Uh, in some cases, it could be a sound, a specific sound, like a certain insect sound, or it could be the smell of bananas. And again, I'm throwing out these examples, and people are thinking like, "Geez, you're picking some weird examples," but these are like actual examples I've heard over the years. So, and it could be touching a certain texture, like a certain fruit or something like that. So again, you're really looking for how their sensory world fits into this. So, maybe you met 3 or 4 here. Maybe you only met 2 or 4. Maybe you met 1 of 4. So if you met 1 of 4, now you've got a little bit of a dilemma. You're thinking, oh, geez, I don't want to fudge the system here, and maybe this is something else like anxiety if I'm really convinced. But I would say for the most people that I test, they would usually meet at least 3 of the 4. But even like I say, even 2 of the 4 is enough. Again, we've been through this before, but going through the levels again. So this is kind of these last few are not as robust as those other categories. These are kind of like the final checks before you make an official diagnosis. Symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities or may be masked by learned strategies in later life. Okay, now this is important. It means that stuff was usually there right from the beginning. The person was slow crawling or talking, or they did okay in their early years, but then as the teen years hit and social functioning became more important, it just got harder and harder. The person picked the person and copied their behavior. If they laughed at a certain time, I laughed at a certain time. If they use a certain phrase, I use a certain phrase. So sometimes that people with autism can be quite clever about learning how to do that, or learning how to mask, which can just be learning how to say what people need to hear in a given situation, even if it isn't what you're feeling. Or like if I learn how to make small talk, I'd be like, "Oh, hello, nice to see you as well." And I've just learned that phrase. That phrase doesn't have any emotional resonance with me. It's just a phrase I've learned because it's something that I've learned about making small talk with people. Category D. Symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, other important areas of function. Okay, so this is important. Again, we might see somebody in level 1 that has a good job, they have a house, they're financially doing okay, but they have no friends, they're extremely lonely, they are really struggling with any kind of social functioning. So that person would meet this criteria, even though you think to yourself, well, geez, that I suppose by a lot of definitions, this person is doing as well as any of us are, but not really, because this idea of the social functioning is really important. The reason they may have come to your office is they just don't know how to go about um, fixing that particular problem. It's like, geez, I've never been good at it. We talked about that chaining thing earlier about sort of withdrawing back into you. So, all right. So this category, these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability or global developmental delay. And it does make the point that these do co-occur quite a lot. So it doesn't mean if somebody has intellectual disability, they couldn't have autism. In fact, they often go together. But if somebody had an intellectual disability, but was quite social and loving and friendly and didn't seem to meet a lot of the autistic categories, then that person would not have an autism diagnosis. Now, this is important. So individuals with a well-established DSM-4, that was the previous DSM, of autism, Asperger's, or pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, should be given the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Okay, well, that's interesting. What are you saying here? Um, Basically, a lot of times you'll see somebody come in with a big stack of papers. it's from an OT, it's from a school counselor, it's from a pediatrician, and it has said, I believe this person has autism, or in some cases they'll actually bring in an assessment. And so what we're seeing right here in the DSM is, okay, that's very, very valid. If a professional person has previously diagnosed autism, we should respect that. That's essentially what this category means. So here in New Zealand, the Ministry of Disabled People, this would be a good place to start in terms of, like, okay, completing a needs assessment. Okay, so again, somebody comes into my house, maybe, or if that's comfortable for them, and like, okay, well, what do you need? What problem are you trying to solve? What can I help you with? And they would say, okay, well, geez, this person really struggles with this transportation thing, or cleaning their house, or even personal hygiene, or really just can't seem to find a job. So it could be a lot of things, honestly. It could be none of those. Um, and you really are trying to get a sense of how these dots can get connected. Okay, so let's get this person a support worker and see if we can help them. A lot of people I've worked with have been in that early 20s range, and they've taken them out on camping trips and hiking, and even social functionings with the opposite sex. And I've worked with some people that have been on that show, Dating on the Spectrum, but I mean, and I don't want to make light of that. Sometimes the dating thing can be extremely something somebody really wants. They just, again, don't know how to go about it. So again, this needs assessment is really important. It's kind of like, okay, well, let's at least figure out first of all what someone needs. Altogether Autism is another good group, one called SB Help, which would be a little more towards people that would be at that level one level previously. An Auckland peer group, Autism New Zealand. Um, these are all groups that are good. This peer group has a big Facebook page. Sometimes they have events, different things like that. So these levels of support are different than the previous levels of support, in the sense that the first one would be very much how you would sort of handle the legal, financial type of problem, whereas this would be more helpful with the social side of things. Now, altogether, autism would know how to get. A lot of times, people don't know where to start. So, let's say you join this Auckland peer group, and somebody said, "Oh, you know what? I know a great psychologist that helps people get diagnosed, and this has been part of my story." And so, if you can join a Facebook group like that, and actually be amongst people who have been through a similar process, would be really comforting. Like, oh, okay, good. I feel comfortable with these people. People are telling their stories here, and I know I'm not alone here. So that can be extremely helpful. So again, I've helped quite a lot of people with this in my life, and I feel like it's probably one of the more meaningful pieces of work I've done in my career, in the sense of, like, the difference between someone that's actually getting help and support, and the difference with someone that's not getting that help, can be so far apart, almost to the point of, like, absolute life changing. Like, in some cases, actually getting a roof over their heads, or even getting their first job at the age of 35, or having a social network for the first time ever at 21. And so some of these dots just need to get connected. A lot of people might know they need help, or they might know their child, who is an adult child, needs help, but they just don't know where to start. So a lot of times when you do go to a professional, yes, it's important to get a diagnosis and assessment, but also it's important for that person to help steer you in the next direction as well. So that's kind of what we aim to do with our autism clinic, is not only just to help people clarify that diagnosis, but actually help them get on their way to the next steps as well.